Once again, it is so good to see everyone this morning. Glad to be back with you. We very much enjoyed our trip. It was very refreshing and enjoyable, and we are now so glad to be able to see everyone again. The Garden of Eden. That is our setting for this morning. The very beginning of time, the very beginning of mankind, basically the very beginning of everything, at least in terms of us as humans and all that we're thinking about there. This was the place where God put the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve, asked them to tend the garden and to keep it, filled the garden with what they could eat, the fruits of the trees and the herbs of the field. I believe that's something like that, how it's described. Basically provided for them in every possible way that he could. And as they're in the garden, he only asks one thing of them, that they not partake of the fruit of the knowledge, or the tree rather, of the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit of this tree they were not to eat. He says, the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. We have heard a lot of different ideas, I'm sure, based on this account at the beginning of the Bible. We have talked, I'm sure, in many different classes, lessons about the idea of what we sometimes call the fall, where mankind rebels and does eat of the fruit. We've talked about perhaps the nature of the garden itself and the perfect, fellowship or unity that man had with God in this context before sin drove a wedge between them. This morning I want to talk about something that's just slightly different, perhaps at least, than what we often think about in this text. We're going to dive a little bit deeply into this phrase, the knowledge of good and evil. Because I think there's something here that we often overlook. And while it may not be something that is just earth-shattering in its implications, although in some ways I think it is, at least I hope that as we dig deeper into this phrase this morning, we will gain a deeper appreciation for what the account in Genesis 2 and 3 has to tell us about the nature of sin and temptation, and that perhaps that will be helpful to us in our daily life. So let's think about this idea of the knowledge of good and evil. And here's why. What does that mean? That should be the question we ask when we come across this idea of a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because isn't it just the tree of good and evil? After all, they are told to do good. By eating of the fruit of the tree, they do evil. So it is the tree of good and evil. Why knowledge? Where does knowledge come into this equation? If we start really asking that question, I think we're going to begin to uncover some ideas that we may not have thought of before. But as we think about this, we first need to ponder the command that God gave to Adam and Eve regarding this tree, because that also will help us as we begin to make these connections in our mind. So we need to first ask a question. What could Adam and Eve choose? Now this is a strange question perhaps, because it's rarely asked. But we need to think about the implications if we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the garden and the implications of all of these things. What could they actually choose? Let's go back to Joshua for just a moment in this idea of choice. Of course, this is many, many years after the events of the Garden of Eden, but if we go back here for just a moment, notice as Joshua is presenting to the people of Israel, essentially before his death, what they need to do, notice what he says. Choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served, he goes on the other side of the river, the gods of the Amorites, so forth and so on. Basically, any of these gods over here, or serve the Lord, right? If it's evil to serve the Lord, then serve these gods. But he's holding, figuratively in his hands, two choices. Choose this or this. Anytime we are faced with a decision, it wouldn't be a decision if we didn't have multiple choices, would it? There's always these two choices set before us. But let's go back to the Garden of Eden for just a moment. Notice what God says to Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 as he places them in the garden. He has told them, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. He has told them, I want you to tend this garden, to keep it. He has told them, I'm giving you all of this bounty to partake of. It will sustain you as you eat of it. He says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. Now, I want us to think very closely about this statement in light of this idea of choice. What did Adam and Eve have the ability to choose? In terms of their physical and mental makeup, what did they have the ability to choose? They can eat of the tree or not, right? Those were the two choices. They eat of the tree, they don't eat of the tree. Very simple. But which of those choices was offered to them by God? Only one. The only choice God presents to them is don't eat. Let's think for a moment. If we go into a restaurant, let's say McDonald's, because everyone knows McDonald's, right? Listen, I don't often go to McDonald's. I think mainly because I don't like it. I think she actually likes it. But nonetheless, you go into McDonald's. Now let's say, just for the sake of argument, they are out of every single thing on the menu except for a Big Mac. Do you have the ability to choose anything on the menu? Well, yes, you have the ability to choose, but how many choices are there? Just the Big Mac, right? You see, there's a difference between being able to choose. That's what it means for us to have free will. We can choose between options, but there's a difference between having the ability to choose and having actual choices. And God only presents them with the one choice. Don't eat. So even though they can choose either one, God does not present them with any temptation. He does not offer them the second choice. He gives them one choice. He says, this is what you can do. Don't eat. So even though they have the ability to choose, they only have one option so far. It takes another being to introduce another choice before they have options. They have the ability the whole time. But only when Satan comes do they suddenly have options, plural. Notice when Satan, the serpent, approaches Eve and asks in his devious way, has God really said you can't eat from the trees of the garden? Of course, he is misconstruing the command. And Eve initially gives him a straight answer, kind of modifies what he has said. He's like, no, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden. But God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden. She's saying, we have, in terms of this one tree, we have an option. We won't eat of it. And of course, that is when Satan, again in his devious way, offers her another choice. He says, essentially, if you read on in the text, oh, that's not true. You won't die. If you eat the fruit, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Again, that word knowledge, we'll come back to that. But notice what Satan has done in offering this advice, if we want to call it that, he's articulated a second option. Now, not only does Eve have the ability to choose, she has two choices from which to choose. And Satan is doing his best to make that second option, which is new to her, very appealing. Saying, number one, it won't come with consequences. Number two, it will actually come with benefits. And allowing her own desires, as we see moving on the text there, what essentially amounts to the lust of her eye, the lust of the taste. She knows that it will be not only pleasant to the eye, but it will be good. And also the fact that, well, she will be like God, an aspect perhaps of pride even involved here. Allowing all those desires within her, now that she has the second option, he allows them to do their work. So notice what has happened as we begin exploring this idea of the choice. They always had the ability to choose, Adam and Eve did. But before the serpent comes, they were only given one choice, one option. What does Satan introduce to them? What does it take to have a choice? It takes knowledge of the choice, doesn't it? Let's say there's another item on the menu at McDonald's that is in fact available, but it's marked as out of stock as well. Well, you don't know you have that other choice unless someone gives you the knowledge that it is also available. Which leads us to our second point. Our second question, really. How did their knowledge change? That's been the focus this whole time, hasn't it? Even though we often overlook it. He says, don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Satan says, you will be like God if you eat the fruit, knowing good and evil. And so, Eve and then Adam eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. So what changed in their knowledge? Did they know it was physically possible for them, even before the serpent, did they know it was physically possible for them to eat any fruit in the garden, including the fruit of this tree? Even though it wasn't a choice in the sense of disobeying what God had said, perhaps, the actual ability to eat, they recognized, that knowledge didn't change. So what changed about their knowledge? This is where things become really interesting, and God, in putting this account at the beginning of the book of Genesis, begins to give us some insights into the nature of sin that we would do well to remember. We're going to use the example that I would argue the text uses to show us the nature of this knowledge. Notice at the end of Genesis 2, verse 25. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Now, we're not going to go into all the details of the implications of that. We have plenty of implications in the establishment of marriage at the end of chapter 2. But the idea is that while obviously they both knew, in the sense of knowing what existed, that they were naked, they didn't, how shall we put this? They didn't have any knowledge that that was anything strange. They didn't have any understanding of anything being amiss about that. There was nothing about that that seemed connected with anything else. That just was the way things were and didn't even cross their minds. But notice in the text what happens immediately after they eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7, they eat the fruit, then the eyes of both were opened, So they took bites of the fruit with their eyes closed, right? No, not literally, meaning they see something, they know something they didn't know before. And as a result of that knowledge, what are we told they also realize? They knew they were naked. Well, they already knew that, right? Well, yeah, in a sense. But now they know it in a different way. Something's different about, there's an implication now that there wasn't before. And they don't want to be naked anymore. Even though this is the only two human beings on earth, the man and his wife, they sew fig leaves together and make themselves loincloths. Now, why would they do that? Perhaps one could say, well, they know that God said they would surely die if they eat the fruit, so maybe they're trying to protect themselves, but a loincloth, that's not going to protect you, right? That's not any kind of armor or anything like that. No, it's something else. Remember the statement at the end of chapter 2, they were not ashamed of their nakedness before they ate the fruit. So what is it they know? What has changed? Notice what God says as he comes into the garden and sees them hiding themselves from him. He asks, why are you hiding, essentially? Technically, he asks, where are you? But the implication is, what are you doing? Look at yourself. Why are you hiding from me? And Adam's response, you remember? He says, I was afraid. That in of itself didn't exist before. That's strange. But I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. And God responds, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? What changed? What does the nakedness or not nakedness have to do with anything? I know I'm using the word naked a lot in the Sunday sermon, but the scripture does too, so I don't feel too bad about it. It's there for a reason. It's making a point. It's trying to help us see something in a bigger picture. They saw, they knew, they recognized choices, options, wrongs that they hadn't seen before. I'm not talking about just specifically in relation to their nakedness or anything like that. That was a sense ultimately of, again, shame. Something they hadn't had, something they hadn't even comprehended. Shame, fear, all of these ideas coming from whatever this knowledge was. What was the knowledge? It was the knowledge that just as they had had the option presented to disobey God in regarding fruit, the eyes were opened to see that was a possibility in any situation. It's so hard for us, and that is why I think the account is written as it is. It is so hard for us to comprehend existence, life, knowledge, before sin was even a thought in the mind of mankind. Quite frankly, we can't imagine that. Because the thought, the option of sin has always been in all of our minds, ever since it was introduced in the garden. From very young children, we have seen, in the actions of those around us, the possibility of not only obeying what we are told, but disobeying. But Adam and Eve hadn't. And so by being introduced to the possibility of sin by eating the fruit, and then actually taking the step to eat it, their eyes were open. Not that there was anything magical or mystical in the fruit itself. It's just another tree. There's no indication in the text that there's anything about the tree itself that was special. What was special was what they did with it because of the command God had given, which allowed them to realize, oh, everything God has made, God has done, I have a choice of how I use it. I have a choice of what I do with it. I have a choice of whether or not I abide by God's design, whether or not I act according to God's commands, or I don't. Once Satan planted that instance of temptation, it suddenly took on a life of its own in all other areas of their minds. Again, they knew the fruit was edible before eating it. But afterward, they realized not only could they sin, meaning violate what God had told them in that area, but it opened up all the possibilities. True, God had not given any other explicit laws at this point, but whenever he did, they realized they could either obey or not. And that knowledge was not there until they ate of the fruit. Satan introduced the temptation, and upon acting on it, they gained the knowledge. So what does that mean for us? Why do these things matter? Why are we digging so deeply into this concept? I know we're getting a little bit philosophical, right, with the text, but we are in the text and sticking with the context no less. Why does this matter? What does it help us to comprehend these things? Notice, God, after seeing all that has happened, after having this conversation with mankind in the aftermath of the fall, notice what he observes. Behold, the man has become like one of us. Us, he is talking about God, knowing good and evil. The serpent wasn't lying in that if they ate the fruit, they would know good and evil like God did. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. And of course, we know the rest of the story. God cast them out of the Garden of Eden. But notice this statement. He has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. God knew that could not be undone. If I tell you a piece of information, if I tell you, oh, let's just throw something out there. One of the places Liz and I went on our vacation was called Forsyth Square. Now, that I told you that, please forget it. Well, it doesn't work like that, does it? You have the knowledge now. I can't undo what I just did. In the same way, God recognized once this knowledge entered the mind and the heart of mankind, it could not be undone. Mankind could never go back to their state of innocence where only one option was before them, and that was to do the will of the Creator. And so began the long history of sin, temptation, death, in the history of mankind. James gives us some interesting insights as we think about this idea of temptation and sin. Let no one say, James tells us, I am being tempted by God. What is temptation? It is the presentation of a choice to sin, of a choice to do wrong. Again, God's not the one who said, but you can also eat of the fruit if you want to. Even though I'm telling you not to, you can violate my command and do it. No, that was Satan. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. And yet notice, there is a tempter nonetheless. Each person, James goes on, is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. How did the serpent tempt Eve? he took her desires and twisted them, presenting this option by which those desires would appeal to her, and she would do the rest. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And of course, he goes on, sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Sin can't happen without temptation. But God's not the tempter. Satan is the one who has introduced temptation into our world. But he uses our own desires to get us to follow through. But, as I'm sure we are familiar, that temptation is not irresistible. Paul assures us, no temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. In other words, we don't get to say, no one has ever had it as hard as I do in terms of whatever temptation we were facing. No. Not only has Jesus himself, as the Hebrews writer tells us, endured every kind of temptation known to man, plenty of other people have gone through the same type of temptation. No, not the same exact situation, but the same type of temptation. Nevertheless, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. And he goes on, with the temptation will allow you a way of escape. So what do we learn as we put all these concepts together? Where sin exists, and it exists in many places, where sin exists, there is always a tempter. There is always a source of temptation. Ultimately, we can trace that all the way back to Satan himself. But it is never God who does the tempting. And there is always a choice. Yes, whenever we encounter temptation, we have the options there in front of us, and often sin is very appealing. But we don't get to blame God for the existence of that temptation, because he's not the tempter. There is a tempter, make no mistake, but it's not God. We don't get to blame him for allowing us to encounter that temptation. We don't get to blame him for presenting us with that temptation, because neither is his doing. And we always have a choice. Instead of being the tempter, he is the one who always provides us with a way of escape. Just like in the Garden of Eden, at first they only had the one option to choose. There is never a case where when we are faced with temptation, that is our only option. From then on, there would always be two. Either serve God or serve Satan. In every situation, in every decision, we have those two choices. Those two options are always available. But only we can make the choice. The story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was intended, I would argue, to help us better understand the nature of sin. But it will only help us if we are willing to learn. Again, as I said, we got a little deep in the weeds, right? We got a little into some of the implications, really digging into the context there, but I hope, I know I can speak for myself, I hope that if we understand these principles, if we understand what God is telling us, even in this original account in Genesis, it will help us as we ourselves face sin, face a choice between good and evil. We have the knowledge of good and evil. We can't undo that. Mankind has had that ever since the garden. That can't be undone. But we can make the right choice. That is where we have the power. That is where we have been given the option, if we are willing. If there's anything we can help you with this morning, any perhaps temptations or sins you are facing that you are struggling to overcome, we want to help you. We want to support you, to encourage you. That's part of why we exist as a family of God, so that we can assist one another as we are trying to serve Him. If there's anything we can do to help you this morning, please let us know as we stand and sing. What will you do with Jesus? The question comes to you.